Hello and welcome to this second podcast in our series on tax and regulatory matters. In today's podcast, we're going to hear three presentations which were given live recently at the Gherkin in London on the 5th of February at an event organised by Horner & Roberts, a recruitment firm. The presentations are given by myself on FATCA, Collette O'Gorman from Baringa on EMIR, and Mark Davies from AVOX, talking about both EMIR and FATCA in terms of client data issues. Being a live event, the audio quality is not quite what we'd have hoped for, but in the end, we hope the quality of the content more than makes up for that. So without further ado, let's listen to what everybody has to say.
Evening, everybody. Are we all well? I'm going to tell you, when I was first asked by Alex to come and talk to you, I thought, I've always wanted to do a stand-up comedian, and now I've got the chance because I've been asked to do FATCA. And that's usually the most common response I get to FATCA, which is a sort of nervous laugh. I want to try and make tonight as valuable and useful for you as possible. I travel typically about 140,000 miles a year, so I meet with financial institutions and the people who work in them all over the world. And the biggest issue that FATCA raises is primarily awareness. The second thing that people start to talk about is understanding how it affects their daily lives. And in the consulting business that I run, I tend to work on the basis of the reason I'm coming in to talk to you is so you can figure out what you're going to do tomorrow differently than you did yesterday. And you can only get that by having information. So when it comes down to FATCA, the questions that I keep getting asked are, is it going to go away? Is it going to work? And how the hell do I make it work if it isn't going to go away? So before I get any further, I've got one question, and this really just to get you into an active mode instead of a passive mode. On a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is what does FATCA stand for, and 10 is I know everything about all the regulations in FATCA. Hands up if you think you're between 0 and 3. Hands up if you're between 4 and 7. Okay, and hands up if you're an 8 to a 10. Ooh, scary. I'm not looking forward to the question and answer bit now, especially for these two. Anyway, first point, I'm going to talk as long as I'm able to and I'm allowed to, and I'm going to tell you that more often than not, it's really easy to start me talking, it's much more difficult to stop me. So if you've got any questions as I go through this presentation, please stick your hand up, very happy to try and add some value. The first question is it going to go away? The short answer is, I doubt it. I don't think it's going to go away. I do think that there are some pressures being brought to bear from a number of different places, which are going to mean that FATCA may be delayed in certain aspects. And it is very common over the last 12 to 14 months. I've had people say, yes, notice such and such last year means that FATCA is deferred. The fact is FATCA has not been deferred, certain elements of FATCA have been deferred. And that's mainly because the industry has been pushing back on the IRS and the US Treasury about certain aspects that are really difficult for the industry to deal with, and I'll cover those in a couple of minutes. It's also possible that this is going to be slowed down because at last there are elements within the United States who figured out that this is not as simple as it sounds. Within the last few weeks, for instance, the Republican Party in the US has taken an internal vote to go in favor of repealing FATCA. The US Treasury has issued a report a couple of weeks ago which was highly critical of the IRS and the way in which it's tried to put the FFI registration scheme in place and its online capability. And there are significant gaps in that capability. I hesitate to suggest that it might be the same firms that created the Obamacare website, that created the FFI website, but there are certainly some things about that website which are very difficult for foreign firms to handle. And so there are lots of things going on. The US Taxpayer Advocate has also come out with a report that's been extremely critical and highlighted gaps in the Americans' approach to FATCA which could harm American interests. Now, all of that kind of thing has been going on probably for 2 or 3 years, to be honest, and the degree to which the IRS or the US government is going to listen to that and act on that is debatable. What is true is that if you're an American and you want to open a bank account outside the United States, you're probably going to have a big problem, because most financial institutions are not very keen on having Americans as account holders. And that leads me to the second part, which is, well, what's the impact? And I often start, because I'm a purist, and the first thing I like to go is to FATCA doesn't exist. There is no act of US Congress called FATCA. The only act that exists that encapsulates what FATCA is the US Hiring Incentives to Restore Employment Act, which was an act designed to give tax breaks to American companies for 12 months. And one of the provisions of the Hiring Incentives to Restore Employment Act was called offset. In other words, in America, if you're going to impose a set of regulations, you have to have a way of paying for it. So the reality is that FATCA, at its foundation, is a way of paying for tax breaks for American companies. All of those tax breaks have now gone. So the only piece of that act that now exists, that's live, is Title V, which is the offset provisions, which is what you and I know as FATCA. So, are you going to get hit by FATCA? It depends. It depends on how high up the food chain you are. If you're an advisor, if you are a large financial institution, like a global custodian, or if you are part of a large group of connected financial institutions, which in fact is called an expanded affiliate group, then you are going to be seriously hit by FATCA. And that's simply because you need to have an understanding of the whole 1,000 pages of regulation in order to figure out how each of the different bits of your organizations are supposed to understand and comply with the terms of FATCA. Now, for those of you who were in the 0 to 3 or 4 range, the basics of FATCA are very simple. America wants money. It recognizes that its own residents are investing outside the US, and America claims the right to tax the global income of its citizens. And so if they're hiding those assets, they're missing the tax, they're evading tax. So the whole point of FATCA is it's putting onto the non-US financial services industry the burden of figuring out whether there are any Americans hiding their assets outside the US. Now, I'm often asked by financial institutions, particularly high up that food chain, well, surely that's reasonably easy. And actually, yes it is. If a customer brings you a US passport, they're American. FATCA only has 3 outputs. If your client is an American, you send a report to the IRS or to your domestic tax authority at a given point to report that person ultimately to the IRS. That's so that the IRS can compare that report against that American citizen's domestic tax return to see if they're deliberately not declaring their global income. So from that perspective, FATCA is easy. You have an American, you file a report, you're done. If your customer is not an American, it's equally easy. Do nothing. There is no obligation to report somebody who is definitively not an American. The issue sits in between. And that in between is where you have a customer who you don't know whether they're American, or they don't know that they're American. And that's actually quite common. Now, the Americans have had for many, many years very defined law on what it is to be an American in terms of being subject to US tax reporting. So, for example, there are 6 tests that you have to engage in as a financial institution to identify whether your customer is an American or not. But those questions are very intrusive, and they're not questions you typically ask in KYC when you're onboarding a new customer. And so the difficulty in FATCA is really this amorphous piece in the middle where you may have a client who doesn't want to answer a question, and then you've got to call them recalcitrant, American term. And recalcitrant account holders, well, they're going to get ultimately hit with a 30% tax on all of their income, and including gross proceeds ultimately. And within the regulations, there's provision for the financial institution to shut the account after 6 months or so. So there's some fairly draconian views being taken by the Americans that say, we want the rest of the world to go figure out whether there are any Americans in the client base, file reports, and anybody that you're not sure about, you're going to penalise them to the point where the account ultimately is just too expensive to maintain, either by the institution or by the individual concerned. So what are some of those tests? Well, the first test is if anybody in the room has one parent, or more by definition, but has a parent who is born in the United States. You're an American. Whether you like it or not, under FATCA, you're an American. And you have an obligation, whether you knew it or not, to file a tax return to the US government every year. Churchill was an American under FATCA. Boris Johnson is an American under FATCA. And Boris Johnson has 2 passports, and one of them is an American passport. But Churchill, one of his parents, was born in the United States. If you had an account with any of your institutions, you would have to file a report on him as being an American citizen. If any of you had had a green card, and there are many people around the world who visit America, work in America, get a green card, and then leave and go back, and that might be because they're getting an American education, all sorts. But they go back home, and they take the green card and they put it in the trash can. Unless they got rid of the green card by standing in front of a US Circuit Court judge, holding their hand up and revoking their American citizenship, which is what the green card gives them temporarily, that green card stays live, whatever they do with a piece of paper. So anybody who ever had a green card and didn't do that, they're an American. Now you can see that these are kinds of questions that nobody asks when you open up an account. But under FATCA, that's what you're supposed to do, to identify whether your client is an American under America's rules, not under your rules. Now some of that becomes even more complex because people don't just have, as financial institutions, you don't just have individuals, and that's often seen as being the big issue. The other issue is if you've got clients who are, let's say, corporations. And the other big thing about FATCA is you've got to figure out an entirely new language. FATCA is what's called Internal Revenue Code Chapter 4 in the US. And it comes combined with Chapter 3. Those 2 sets of regulation all apply outside the United States. But they have 2 completely different languages. And it's not English. It's tax technical American. And I travel to Asia a lot, and apart from the fact that most of the people in the audience would be going, what's FATCA? When you ask them, do you have any idea of whether your client as a corporation is an NFFE or an NQI, they have no clue what you're talking about. So again, within the organization, depending on how high up in the food chain you are, depends on how much of all this you're supposed to know. If you are a financial group with multiple jurisdictions, with subsidiaries, you've got to figure out what your client base looks like in every one of those jurisdictions, some of which might be jurisdictions where the US has agreed an intergovernmental agreement. So it does get very complicated. The intergovernmental agreement, for those of you who are on the 0 to 3 and possibly the 4 to 6 route, only came about because a lot of financial institutions outside the US said we will be breaking our domestic laws if we send data about our clients outside of our jurisdiction to you in America. And so the Americans figured out we made a bit of a boo-boo here because we're asking the whole world to send us data and some of them can't do it. And so they came up with the concept of an intergovernmental agreement. So the idea of the IGA is simply those markets where a financial institution would be legally prohibited from sending information to the IRS, instead sends it to the domestic tax authority. Now, the financial institution is not breaking its domestic law because it's not sending data outside the country. What then happens is the Americans, under the IGA, ask the tax authorities of that country to send the information anyway. So don't get me wrong, the information will end up with the IRS one way or another. It's not avoiding it, it's merely taking it by a different route. But there are only 21 IGAs in place at the moment. The IRS is working on IGAs with perhaps up to 50 countries. The problem that gives everybody is that as a large financial institution or a group of financial institutions, you now have the problem of going, well, that subsidiary over there is in an IGA country, so their reporting is going to go that way, and they've got certain things that they have to do in documenting their clients, in figuring out, did you have a green card? Was your parent born in the United States? All those questions. They have to do that in a particular way. A different IGA market, your subsidiary will have to do something slightly different, times 21, as it happens at the moment. And those IGAs are not fixed. They're evolving as we speak. The UK agreed, literally at the back end of last year, an annex to their IGA, which made variations to the original intergovernmental agreement. So part of the problem for financial institutions is a moving target. It's very difficult to figure out what you're going to do on an operational base tomorrow when you have a client base and a set of regulation and nobody really knows what it all means. So that gives you the picture that the big financial institutions really do have more of an issue than the ones lower down. The ones lower down, if you're a small financial institution, the IRS's perspective on this is based on what kind of institution you are and where you're resident in the world, really defines one thing. Are you a high risk for a US tax evader? And what they've tried to do as a result of a lot of lobbying in 2011 to 2012 was to figure out that there were things called carve-outs. So the pensions industry, for example, lobbied really hard to say, well, pensions should be exempt because all the pension plan members are likely to be inside the pension fund. And frankly, a pension fund is not the typical place you find someone trying to evade US tax. The problem is that the definition of a pension fund outside the US is different from the legal definition of a pension fund inside the US. And so you've got this long wrangle going on. But when you get down to that stage, if you're a small financial institution or you're a corporation, which in FATCA language is an NFFE, a non-financial foreign entity, the degree to which FATCA applies becomes much smaller. So, for example, I travel a lot to Europe, and I find a domestic European bank. Well, the rules say that you can have deemed compliance. So if you fit certain criteria, for example, if you are a particular kind of bank, and 98% of your clients are resident in the same market in which you are organized as a company, then you can be deemed compliant. So that, of course, takes a whole swathe of the lower level echelons out of FATCA completely, because they can just go to the IRS website and say, we're compliant. Well, it would be, but it's not quite that simple. The IRS decided there are two types of deemed compliance: registered deemed compliance and certified deemed compliance. Now your problem is not how is this big, enormous thing called FATCA going to affect me? It's merely, am I deemed compliant? And if I am, what route am I supposed to take? One is a piece of paper called a W89Y, on which you would certify that you are deemed compliant. That's certification. And the other is you have to go to the IRS website and file a statement to say that you are registered deemed compliant. But the net result is the same. You don't have to do anything more. The big issue for the people further down the financial food chain is that the way in which the IRS has constructed some of these ideas include variables. Let me give you an example. An NFFE, a non-financial foreign entity. So you have a customer who's a corporation. They make widgets. Okay? Now, they're very good at making widgets. The question in FATCA that the financial institution will be asking them is, are you a passive NFFE or an active NFFE? And most corporations, the chief financial officer is going to go, what the hell are you talking about? Well, an active NFFE is one which makes most of its money from making widgets. A passive NFFE is one which makes more than 50% of its revenue in any year from investing the proceeds of making widgets. And so you can see what happens here is I might be a corporation, I've got a financial institution, they say, you need to tell us what you are under FATCA. Okay, what am I supposed to do? Well, we need a W8 Ben E. So I go and fill one of these forms in, and on the form it says, this year I am an active NFFE. But that's a variable. The fact is, if that company is really successful at making widgets, builds up a large treasury fund, and then the market for widgets drops through the floor, the income from the treasury function may start to get close to the income from making widgets, particularly in large economic boom and bust cycles. The net result is somebody's got to keep track of it, because if you don't, you may end up certifying to your financial institution that you are an active NFFE, which by the way means you don't have to do anything in FATCA, and you may flip into being a passive NFFE without even knowing about it. Now the issue there is, there's a concept in FATCA called a responsible officer. And most of the documentation that people like NFFEs and individuals have to sign is signed under penalty of perjury in the US market. The responsible officer is a person at a financial institution or a corporation who is personally signing to say that that organization is compliant with FATCA. It's very similar to a previous set of regulation in the US called Sarbanes-Oxley. And in Sarbanes-Oxley, you can be fined $25,000, get 25 years in prison, or both, if you made a false statement to the IRS. So you can see the degree of seriousness that's viewed here. So the last thing I'm going to say about FATCA talks about some of the practical issues. And I mentioned the W8 Ben E. The whole point of FATCA, whatever the rules are, whatever the little decision tree that you've got to go through, you end up with one thing: documentation. You're going to have to ask your clients to produce documentation which certifies their status under FATCA. That might be your customers, whether they're corporations or individuals, or other financial institutions. In the US system, each financial institution in the chain has to certify what it is to each other institution. In traveling the world, the most common form I come across is the W8 Ben. The failure rate before FATCA is 65 to 70%. I can ask somebody to put 100 of those forms in front of me that are collected from beneficial owners, and I can tell you now, I can reject easily 60 of them because they haven't been validated properly. They're not fit for purpose. And that document is 1 page long. Under FATCA, probably in June or later this year, that 1 page document is going to be replaced with 2 documents, a Ben and a Ben E, and each of them is going to be 6 pages long. The W8 IMY, that is the way in which a financial institution certifies its status to another financial institution, for example, being deemed compliant or not being deemed compliant, that's currently 2 pages long. And in June, the draft is already 12 pages long with 25 sections in it. The serious issue that everybody has is awareness, understanding, to be able to get to the point of even figuring out how to fill this form in. Because if you don't, you're signing the form as a responsible officer under penalty of perjury. There is a major problem sitting in that documentation because it's so complex. It's not written in English, it's written in tax technical American. And so you can see in a very short space of time I've tried to take you from the large organizations which have to know the whole of 1,000 pages of regulation and large numbers of variables, down to the slightly easier route in which clients themselves, like the fund industry and corporations, still have to think of themselves in terms of what documentation they fill and how complex that is.
So, good evening everybody. I'd like to welcome myself. I'm Collette O'Gorman. I work at Baringa Partners, and I'm here to talk about EMIR. I'll be going through the slides in the order, but not spending equal amount of time with them. So, first first of all, I think it's worth just looking back at EMIR and what is the purpose of EMIR. And I think we can describe EMIR in three mandates. First of all, there's risk mitigation, then there's trade and exposure reporting, and finally, central clearing. So central clearing is the one where the regulator, particularly ESMA, is seeking to get more trades put through clearing. So they're held by central counterparties rather than being held on a bilateral basis between counterparties to trades. Risk mitigation, now that's focusing much more on the operational processes that are applied to uncleared trades, with aiming really to make sure that both counterparties have the same view of the trade and they have the same view of that trade for the life of the trade. Because that has been proved, obviously, in issues that have happened in the markets. People haven't had the same views of trades. And the last one is trade exposure and trade reporting. Now this is going to give regulators direct access to everybody's trading data. It means that regulators won't have to come and ask people for data, and they'll be able to undertake their own analysis of data and what people are doing. And also it's going to enable regulators to also see if people are complying with the risk mitigation techniques. So they won't have to rely on companies doing self-reporting. They can look at what they've reported to see, are they confirming trades, and they should confirm the trades. Clearly, this is going to be very, very different for everyone in the market. Now, if we move on, and this will be slide 3, we have the EMIR roadmap. And really, at this point, with trade reporting going live next week, we're approaching halfway into the roadmap. So the risk mitigation obligations have already been implemented, but broadly, really, they were existing processes people had in their businesses. Most people were already confirming trades, and in some areas, portfolio reconciliation, portfolio compression were already undertaken. So really, people had to focus more on perhaps tightening up their processes, improving their reporting, so they could actually confirm that they were actually complying. The area perhaps where there was a big difference here is for the non-financial counterparties, who now have to determine whether they're above or below the clearing threshold, and they've got to be actively monitoring that to make sure that if they go over the threshold, they declare it and that they change to meet their higher obligations. And obviously, if you're above the threshold, if you fall below it, then quite clearly you want to be able to get yourself unregistered. So, because we want higher obligations. Now we come on to the very, very close one, which is trade reporting, which is live in 8 days, and I'll go into that in more detail in a second. But it's also worth touching on the mandatory clearing, because this is still only partly developed. We don't know fully what mandatory clearing is going to look like. Clearing houses are in the process at the moment as registering as CCPs. They're also going through the process of implementing client account segregation, which their clearing members are going to have to replicate once they do it. But the next level of regulations hasn't been drafted, so the really key question of what products will be subject to mandatory clearing, will there be exemptions around those, what would they look like, that hasn't been answered yet. So that is a big uncertainty. But what we will focus on next is the trade reporting, because with that going live in 8 days, it's clearly at the moment, hopefully, on most people's minds. So on slide 4, it gives an overview of the reporting. Now, it's worth reflecting here, you know, what happened in the US with Dodd-Frank, because they've already gone through this process. Now, in the US market, the regulators staggered the implementation of reporting. So swap dealers, major swap participants, so their equivalent of financial counterparties and NFC pluses, they went live first. And then the majority of people, the equivalent to the NFC minuses, they went live much later, approximately 6 to 10 months later, depending on their size and their market. And the US regulator also staggered the implementation by asset class, so credit and rates went live marginally earlier. However, EMIR has decided to take a different approach. We were going to have a segregation by asset class, but because there were no trade repositories approved, we've now got all asset classes and all market participants all going live with all of their reporting on the same day. Needless to say, this is a very, very big bang. And I think not just for market participants, but for the trade repositories as well, where basically virtually everyone will switch on the 12th. So we also look of, well, what do people have to report? What's the scope of reporting? So everyone has to report who's in the EU, all their trades, both their OTC trades and their cleared trades. Cleared means futures and cleared OTC. And so far it looks like the EU is the only regulation of this kind where you have to report futures. All other markets, it's been only OTC, because futures, they can already get the information from the clearinghouse. European companies have to report trades with all of their counterparties, whether their counterparty is within the EU or outside the EU. And they also have to report their intra-group trades. And by here they mean when they do a deal with somebody else in their same company group, that trade is equally reportable under the trade repository obligation. It's exempted from some of the other obligations under EMIR, but not from trade reporting. And this is proving challenging in some areas. People have to commence, as I said, reporting in 8 days' time with their live population. Some of those they can report 90 days later. And then, over the next 3 years, people will have to report all of the trades that expired between the EMIR go live date, which was 16th of August 2012, and 12th of October 2014, which is going to be quite a significant undertaking for people to go back and get nearly 2 years' worth of expired trade data. But we do have 3 years for that one. So then you actually look at, on a trade, what must be reported? Well, on new trades, you must report the initial execution of the trade, and then on all trades, it must be reported every event on the trade that happens to the trade for its entire life. And in both cases, these must be reported by the end of the following business day. So this means if a trade booking is changed, whether it's a correction to the booking, or whether you've agreed to change with a counterparty, whether the trade's been terminated, novated, whatever, the aim is the repository must have the same view of the trade that you have of the trade. And you have to give a reason as to why you've changed the report to the repository. So you just can't merely give them the latest version of the trade. You have to put a reason as to why that trade has changed, which can be particularly challenging to identify that. Within the trade details, it's split into 2 parts. First, we have counterparty data under EMIR, which is information which would be specific to each counterparty and may not be the same, and quite likely to be different. And then you have common data, which is the trade data, which should be, and this is what the regulators ultimately want to check, should be the same between the 2 counterparties. Though for reasons we'll come on to later, that's actually going to be quite difficult to actually reconcile. So when we actually look at the challenges that we get from reporting, first one is clearly we've got a lot of new static data that people have to use, such as the legal entity identifier to identify themselves and the counterparties, which means people must go through a process of applying for one, gathering in all the information for their counterparties, populating it and sending it to the repository. And that's going to be, and is already proving, quite challenging, because on a global basis they've not been able to as yet set up a single source of legal entity identifiers, so we've ended up with a country-specific solution. The very big challenge for people is that one thing that ESMA wants on the trade is a unique trade identifier, or a UTI. And the EMIR regulations require that both parties to the trade report to the trade, to the repository, or to their respective repositories with the same UTI. Now this, EMIR wants this, or ESMA wants this, so that it can match trades up easily. Their theory being, if both people use the same identifier, they can just match it up. In practice, this is hugely challenging. It means both parties must somehow agree and share a same unique trade identifier on a trade with each other before the D+1 reporting deadline. So, a bit more about UTIs. One thing, the decision that ESMA took was that the UTI must also be put on the existing trade population that's reported on day one, on the 12th of February. This means all European companies across all trading markets, across every single trade, must exchange and share with their counterparty a UTI. And I don't think there has ever been such a large logistical undertaking ever across trading markets. And that this is proving particularly difficult. The other thing that's difficult is the trade ID must be unique. How are two people going to ensure that the trade ID that they agree is not going to be the same as an ID that somebody else is going to come up with? And unfortunately, this is one area where ESMA, really their leadership was needed, and they haven't provided any. ESMA hasn't provided any guidance as to how to ensure the UTI will be unique, who will generate it, who should generate it, and how it should be communicated. They've just assumed that all of the thousands of companies in the market can agree this between them. Now, this doesn't mean that there hasn't been any work done. ISDA has done a lot of work and produced a white paper with a recommendation on how people should approach this. But we've also seen through specific trading sectors as well, other groups come up with other suggestions on how to do this. And that's in the OTC market. When you look at the cleared market, it's slightly more consistent in that CCPs are just declaring that they're going to do it, and it's kind of hard for people to argue with them, and the same with the clearing members. But what we've seen to date, so only 8 days to go, I say the experience to date on UTI is that we've ended up with a very splintered approach. Different companies are taking different ways on what they think should be the methodology to create it and share it. Some are just going ahead, they're not communicating with their counterparties. Others are communicating, but the two companies want to do it differently, and there is no route to resolution. And others have said they're not planning to share, they're going to wait to the inter-trade repository reconciliation and just sort it all out after the event. The other area where this has been particularly difficult is actually allocating a UTI to a trade. It seems simple, but it isn't until you get to this point that it starts to come out. Everybody has different booking systems. Everyone has different ways of booking the same trade. And it is quite probably surprising the number of varieties out there. So you can see anything from one person who's got one trade booked in their system, one UTI, somebody else has 12 trades booked in their system, and they're looking for 12 UTIs. And it's pretty difficult to reconcile how you're going to deal with this. And it also feeds into the earlier point, why does the regulator want a UTI? They wanted a UTI because they thought it'd be easy to match data with both parties reporting. But clearly, because people do have different booking systems, different trading systems, we're not ending up on a one-to-one relationship on UTIs. And we really, at the moment, do not know how this is going to resolve itself, but clearly is going to have to become a key issue that there is going to have to be some consistent action to resolve post-go live. So I think that's our major issues on really just highlighting the key data challenges and what has to be reported for EMIR. we move on then to slide 5, we'll see then, well, how do companies go about implementing compliance? Basically, there's two broad approaches. There's the DIY approach, do it yourself, or there's the can I find somebody else to do it approach. Because EMIR does allow people to report the trade on your behalf. You can ask whether it's your counterparty to report on your behalf, whether you're executing for a platform, they may be willing to do it. If you're going through an electronic confirmation platform, they may be willing to do it. Though it should be noted, even if you get somebody to report on your behalf, you're still accountable and responsible for the reporting. And both solutions, have their pros and cons. And really what solution people implement is really what's appropriate for their business. What we are seeing some of is, obviously the larger banks are doing their own reporting, quite broadly. Smaller companies probably seeking people to report on their behalf. And then companies in the middle may be developing to do the OTC reporting, but look for their clearing member or CCP to report the cleared trades that are more standardised. However, one of the problems that everyone is likely to end up with is the inter-trade repository reconciliation. This is an obligation on trade repositories, where they have to reconcile the data between each other, and the idea is to ensure that both counterparties to the trade have reported the trade. So at the moment, the trade repositories are working together to come up with a process on how they're going to share the UTIs, so that then they can identify the orphans, so the unmatched UTIs. Then those will go back to the relevant counterparty or company to say, here's your list of unmatched UTIs, you need to do something about it. Now clearly there are going to be quite a lot of unmatched UTIs because many EU companies are trading with people outside the EU. They have no obligation to report. Most of them, it's highly unlikely most will report, so obviously there's going to be a big unmatched list there. But even within that, because of the challenges of UTI sharing, because of the challenges of different trade bookings, it is very likely there is going to be a lot of unmatched, particularly on the OTC side. At the moment, though, we don't actually know how trade repositories are going to do this. We know they're in discussions, but at the moment we actually haven't seen anything from operationally, what it will look like, how they'll feed the information to people. And we have no expectations on, what's the regulator's expectations for people resolving these. So, closing summary now. I think, we are close now to one of the major milestones of EMIR. I think in practice, the real operational challenges for people in the business have yet to actually hit them. That's really only going to happen once we've gone live and once all of these problems start flushing out and trades are being executed in a post-EMIR reporting world, when this has got to become part of the day-to-day operations. Another thing that is likely to happen though, is once reporting is set up and regulators have started to see the data, that's when they're going to start to see the inconsistencies. The fact that they haven't put any standards, there's little standardisation out there, and that in reality means there's likely to be some rework further down the line. And we're already seeing this in the US, where the Commodity Futures and Trading Commission, reporting's been live for nearly a year there now, and they've just set up an internal cross-department working group to look precisely at trade reporting, consistency of data, standardisation. So, because they've realised, and they've been quite open about this, they're getting all this data, but they don't understand it. And they can't make meaningful analysis out of it. So this is where we are with EMIR. So, about halfway through, we've still got more to go after this with mandatory clearing. But we shouldn't forget, though, that in whole for trading markets, EMIR is not the end of the line for the European markets. We've still got more regulations coming through, such as MiFID II, which is going to deal with the pre-trade transparency and post-trade transparency. And for anyone who's operating in global markets, we're seeing reporting coming in other countries, very noticeably, Switzerland is now working on regulations, Singapore's a long way down the line, Canada, regions of Canada are down the line, Australia, it seems, once one country wants a repository, they all want one. Well, thank you very much, and I will hand on now to the next person.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the client data specific challenges of the regulations, in particular EMIR and FATCA, and thank you to the two other presenters for giving me lots of good information, and hopefully the same for all of you too. I'm going to start by just trying to understand the challenge. So we'll talk a bit about the specific challenge that this brings for firms at the moment. We'll look a little bit about how we can approach the problem. So what can we do to try to identify solutions and lasting solutions to ensure that data content and information quality that is used to drive reporting is of a sufficiently high standard. And we'll talk in particular about moving from a reactive position to having a position of confidence in the information that's passing through your systems and ultimately passing out of the door. And then we'll finish with any questions as well. So just to start with, the scale of the challenge that firms face at the moment is monumental, both in terms of the number of regulations, and I don't think anyone would question the amount of work that organisations are putting into meeting these regulations, but also in terms of the scale, in terms of the sheer amount of information that's being passed backwards and forwards. I heard an interesting stat the other day, which was that the information passing through one trade repository was equal to greater than twice the volume that goes through Twitter on a daily basis. So there's a lot of information that needs to be passed from financial institutions to the regulatory community. It's clear that reference data, client reference data, is increasingly an important component in helping firms to achieve the regulation. It's certainly an area that organisations can isolate, and ultimately it should be a relatively small part of the problem. If firms are able to do this right and dedicate the right resources, the right thinking to managing client data and sourcing information, then ultimately it's a bit like the water in the tap. It should be there and it should be available so that the focus can be on ensuring the transactions passing through into all systems can be aggregated and passed out alongside the reference data. So hopefully I can give a few pointers today from some of our conversations with our clients that might help to think, the organisations to think in terms of the places where you can isolate some of the client data sourcing and maintenance problems. So I think a lot of the challenge here stems from the fact that the data points that we're starting to see requested, whether it's for FATCA, whether it's for EMIR, whether it's for Dodd-Frank reporting, a lot of the data points, a lot of the information that's needed is new information. It's not information that traditionally was captured as part of the KYC, client onboarding and traditional reference data processes that most organisations run. That's not wholly true. Obviously there's going to be crossover, and understanding who your counterparty is a fundamental principle of any organisation. But there are various different data points and pieces of information that really are quite unique, and we're seeing for the first time. That creates different challenges from both sourcing, but also in terms of how the information is stored and captured, system transformation and changes to architecture. So it really is a crossover that we really haven't seen from a regulatory point of view before, because of the sheer scale of regulation that's asking for client data change. I think it's also worth saying that no two organisations are going to be the same. We all know that as you look at the information for large sell-side institutions, and increasingly with the EMIR requirements and FATCA requirements, the needs of the buy side as well. If you look at the architecture of the firms, the architecture has been shaped by sometimes mergers and acquisitions, and very often there are few organisations that have a simple architecture which has grown organically over time. And that certainly plays a part in the challenges the firms experience in getting data to the right place in order to do the reporting. Having said that, the way in which you can approach the challenge doesn't necessarily need to be different. Architecture can be put to one side, and I think the questions that firms need to ask in order to get the right information to the right place are a consistent set of questions. So, one thing I want to ask is around information quality and content. Where does good quality information about counterparties sit within organisational priorities? And I think at the start of any regulatory reporting project, it's going to fit pretty high up the scale. So firms are going to approach any regulation with information quality really at the forefront, because it's clear that if you don't get the information about your customers right, there's really not a very strong foundation on which to marry transactional information. But as regulation, or as we pass through regulation and get to implementation dates, I think a lot of firms will hold their hands up and say that content quality and sourcing tends to be pushed to one side, or at least drop down the priority order. As the race to get to implementation, the race to react to changes, and often very late changes, which come from the regulatory community, really helps organisations to focus their mind in different areas. So, just around the content sourcing, there are a couple of things that I think are important for firms, and as we get very close to the EMIR implementation date, and clearly with FATCA, with a very key date coming up in June on the FATCA side, organisations can start to look at some of the immediate challenges in order to get to compliance, but really shouldn't lose sight of some of the quality issues which maybe get sidelined along the way. There tends to be a very familiar cycle, and if we look at the recent report that came out from the senior supervisors group around large exposure, counterparty risk reporting, data quality was identified as the one area where it was felt that organisations were really not able to address the concerns of the regulators to the standard that they expected. Information technology investment was an area that was supported, and a few other points were seen as successes. The data content quality and the quality of reporting and the consistency of reporting was really seen as the area of pain. And I think one of the recommendations that came out from the senior supervisors group was to start to identify, or for national regulators to start to focus on improving the data content and incentivising firms to focus on data content. I talked about there being a common life cycle, and if we look at KYC reporting, FCA transaction reporting, and we can expect a very similar pattern to be followed for derivative reporting and indeed FATCA compliance. There's very often a period post-compliance state where organisations have a bit of a honeymoon period. There's an opportunity to ensure that data content and quality improves, and a lot of that is driven by the time that it takes for the regulators to be able to handle the volume and the complexity of the information that they're now receiving. On the EMIR side, we can expect a very similar pattern to be followed that we've seen for both Frank, where there's a 6 to 12 month period before the regulatory community are in a position to be able to handle all of the information that's being passed to them and to really start to analyse the content. But from that point onwards, is it fair to assume that there will be an increased focus on the quality of what's being provided? Will there be, in the same way that we've seen with FCA reporting and also with KYC reporting, is that the point that we start to see an increase in the number of penalties and fines, and certainly very, very public problems for organisations in complying with those regulations? So hitting the dates of February and June in some ways is really just the start of the challenge. The ongoing need to ensure that compliance is maintained from that point onwards will remain, and in some ways will become more acute as time passes. So what are the key questions that organisations need to consider when we're looking at sourcing the right information to match the transactions? Collette talked about the counterparty components of EMIR reporting, and it's very similar for the FATCA reporting as well. There are a series of fields that are required for the reporting template that relate to the transaction and to the product that's being bought and sold, and a series of fields that relate to information around the counterparty or other parties to the transaction. The management of the information that goes into those fields, I think that the start point is really understanding where the information can be sourced. So the questions that organisations tend to ask are, do we have the internal expertise? Do we have the people in-house who can source this information? Is the information already available within KYC and client onboarding systems? And if not, then can we go away and source it based on the people that we already have in-house? Often the answer to that question is to throw bodies at the problem. So client data has never really been commoditized in the same way that instrument and time series information is commoditized. And I think the sourcing of information that relates to client and counterparty is very often pushed to large groups of individuals to go away and mine information, start to look at regulatory websites, chambers of commerce, company filings. Sometimes the answer to the question is going to be to go back to the client, so outreach back to the client. In some cases, attestation is an option as well, so asking your clients and counterparties to attest to their own information, provide details on whether they are a financial institution or a non-financial institution. But I think it's important to look on a case-by-case basis at each individual field and understand what your data sourcing plan is for each individual attribute. If you take the reporting template and look at the individual counterparty fields and understand, do I have this information internally? Can I source this information? But equally importantly, can I maintain it over time? Getting to a reporting deadline and assuming that the information is going to stay current on an ongoing basis is frankly a trap that many financial firms will fall into. Compliance on day one and ongoing compliance are two very different cases. It's entirely possible to source the right information about your counterparty on day one, but if the maintenance and sourcing plans are not in place to maintain it going forwards, then really it's going to create a pretty major challenge down the line. So whether it's tracking legal entity identifiers, we heard a bit from Collette again about LEIs, and LEI is something that when it's fully implemented should bring significant benefits to the financial services industry in terms of identification of parties to a transaction. But at this stage we have 130,000 legal entity identifiers issued globally. That's frankly a small subset of the parties to transactions. The population is growing daily, and EMIR reporting is certainly helping to drive that. The GMEI utility is something that's actually run by DTCC, and for example, one day last week we saw 2,200 new registrations coming through. So if on a single day you can see a jump of over 2,000 unique legal entity identifiers, how are we able to ensure that within your firms you're able to react to the volume of change that's going through? Firms that you may not have had a legal entity identifier for previously would change the following day. And Collette again talked about the number of different LOUs that exist at the moment. So sourcing information from 14 different places with legal entity identifiers is frankly a challenge that the banks don't really need at this point in time. As we start to look at some of the other fields that are specific for EMIR and Dodd-Frank, I mean, some pretty basic information around your counterparty is, in some cases, pretty hard to come by. So, operationally, where is my counterparty based? Which state and which country are they based in? That information tends to be relatively public, but information around where a company is registered is often a little bit more complex, and the two don't necessarily marry up. When we look at internally whether or not you have the capability to source and maintain this type of information, where a lot of firms tend to fall over is once they go outside their own national jurisdiction. So if you go outside your native language, and assuming that you have a large number of counterparties that you need to report under EMIR or for Dodd-Frank reporting, and indeed for FATCA as well. Once you step outside your own national jurisdiction or language, do you still have the capabilities to be able to find the information and maintain that information over time? Do you have the language skills in-house? Do you know where to go to find the information? Or do you have to rely on constantly going back to your client, which frankly can cause quite a lot of pain with the process and in some ways damage reputation as well. So once we understand a little bit about where we can source the information and how we can manage the information, but there are a number of other data attributes, and they tend to fall into a few different distinct categories. Identifiers it tends to be the first subset. So we talked a little about legal entity identifiers. Under FATCA rules, sourcing and maintenance of GIN codes is going to be an equal problem. There'll be a file of GIN codes which will be published on a monthly basis. And again, every organisation that needs to report under FATCA will need to be able to map these identifiers, which are of course very different to LEI codes, to all of your financial institutions that need to be reported under FATCA. Again, another internal process that needs to be built, or another way in which you need to source and manage that information. FATCA also brings some unique challenges around hierarchy information. So for organisations that are, for certain subsets of the data within the FATCA reporting template, understanding ownership down to 10% level for your counterparty is a requirement. Now, 10% shareholdings and 10% holding stakes in the organisation are often not publicly available information. And again, it's finding the balance between at which point you go back to your counterparty and which point you don't. For FATCA, we ran an exercise against the ADOX core data set. So we have 1.3 million entity records which we manage on behalf of our clients. And against those records, we were able to confidently show that in 80% of cases, the requirement to go back to your client and source a W8 or W9 can be actually filtered down, so that you really focus your attention on the 20% where there's an active need to go back and source a document. If you have enough information on jurisdiction, on the type of entity that you're dealing with, on details around exemptions, so we heard from Ross around some of the exemptions that exist for different fund types. There are both permanent and temporary exemptions within FATCA. And by understanding some of these key data points, it's entirely possible to actually remove a large swathe of your data set from the initial focus of the repapering exercise to go and source W8 and W9 tax forms. So, the last point around the data sourcing, I think if we look at EMIR, there are some very specific challenges. And again, this comes back to understanding in detail about your counterparty, the type of classification they might fall into. EMIR has a concept called counterparty sector. And the counterparty sector is based on a number of different EU regulations. So if you understand the nature of those EU directives, you're able to classify each of your counterparties, each of your financial institutions, into one of 7 different categories. But understanding the difference between an insurance company and a UCITS and the specifics of that EU directive, again, requires some expertise. It's going to require some internal skills and some knowledge base within your organisation. The alternative, once again, is attestation, to go back to the client and ask them to answer the question on your behalf. And again, looking at the scale of the problem, I think your firm has to ask if this is something that you want to do on an ongoing basis. So, before we go to questions, the last thing I want to say is that the data sourcing problem is one that all the organisations are facing at the moment. But as we look at derivative reporting rolling out to multiple other jurisdictions, as we've just heard, and FATCA regulations starting to turn into various different international flavours of FATCA, there are opportunities for your organisations to look at ways that leveraging a single common data set and building off a single common data set, you can actually build essentially a strategic solution at a time without having to re-architect systems. There's a common thread that's going to run through tax reporting and derivative reporting. There will of course be unique requirements, and we've already seen from some of the different national regulators some very distinct attributes that are different between EMIR reporting and Dodd-Frank reporting. But having a common thread, understanding who the common counterparty is, and applying those additional attributes on an ongoing basis, and ensuring that that data is maintained, can give a very common framework, give a central core on which all of your reporting can be based. It doesn't necessarily have to involve a complete re-architecture of systems if you're able to partner with the right organisations and find essentially the right content in a scalable way to tie it back to your transaction information. Okay, thank you.
Well, I hope you managed to understand and get most of what the content was in those 3 speeches. They were all extremely good and well given, if the audio quality was a little bit less than might be expected. However, in summing up what the 3 speakers did say, from my perspective, my presentation on FATCA really focused on the impact and some of the common myths and misunderstandings about fact and fiction, and they're very difficult to disentangle. But really, the impact of FATCA depends to a large extent on where you sit in the financial chain. The higher up you go into the large global custody banks, the more complex and more money is being spent. Whereas down at the bottom, it's very much more simple, but simple is a relative term. Collette gave a great presentation, and she talked about EMIR and the challenges that that's going to bring, many of which are operational. Given that EMIR is due to go live in 8 days from the time that you're probably listening to this podcast, there is still no industry standard for things like UTIs, and so there is a great question mark about how financial institutions and repositories are going to manage some of the practical difficulties of dealing with these enormous amounts of data and matching off all of the trades in a consistent way. So a large number of challenges still to come, and it's going to be really interesting to see how all that comes out. Mark's presentation was looking at both EMIR and FATCA from a data perspective, and certainly the EMIR perspective is fairly obvious. The FATCA perspective, again, comes down to different kinds of data being requested by regulators and how we can find an industry way forward to make sure that when we do come up with different kinds of data that regulators need, that we're able to aggregate it, identify it, codify it, and put it into such a way that not only the regulators can find value in it, but also the industry can get some value from it as well. Given the amount of money that's being spent, that's the least I think that we can probably expect. Well, I hope you enjoyed those 3 speeches. Again, apologies for the lower sound quality. We'd love to hear any feedback that you've got on any of our podcast series, and I look forward to presenting you with another podcast in the very near future. Thank you very much.